Jim, thank you for taking the time. Good morning. How's your day going aside from having to talk about yourself a lot?
It's a beautiful day in New York, so every day is a gift.
Before I ask the stuff that I really was planning on asking, people don't think of you as a New Yorker. When did you actually move here?
I moved here in 2018. I was down here quite a bunch. I did this, Bryan Adams and I wrote a Broadway
Yeah,
musical starting in 2016, and it was like a 2 or 3 year writing project. So I was down here a lot, staying in hotels, um, which the production company paid for, which explains why Broadway budgets are so expensive. But
sure.
um, And just, I've always loved the city. Started coming here. I think my first visit was, oh gosh, way back, like 20, 30 years ago. And I just kept coming back, and just moved here. I love the
Wow.
city. The energy is amazing. Always.
The wife and I did see that Broadway play. We enjoyed it. I assume you're talking about Pretty Woman and all that,
I
but
am, yeah.
that ties in with the first question I have. Are you still semi-retired? Is that where you're at still career-wise?
I don't really like the word retired. People ask me, are you retired? And I say, no, just tired. I mean, I've been writing songs since I was, 13 or 14, and I'm 73 now. So, the well gets a little dry.
Sure.
But I mean, I'm working with Bryan right now. He's got a new album coming out
Oh.
in September, and I've got 2 songs on that. So we're kind of still fussing a bit back and forth on those. So yeah, I'm still involved.
I'm glad to hear that. The one
Yeah.
time I met Brian, I did an email interview, but I saw him at a Lime Alliance charity gala, and I
Right.
went up to him, and people were being very respectful, but I went up to him and I said, uh, "My wife and I played the first song from your latest album at our wedding," and he was taken back, like, "What? You like Get Up?" And I go, the guy's still making incredible albums all these years later. So I'm looking forward to your work with him. But this is the Jim Vallance interview. So is the point that you're at still just writing a couple songs a year?
I don't know about a couple, but yeah, I mean, I was full on for 50 years,
Yeah.
7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And it was a ton of fun and a ton of work. And I'm not quite done, but I'm certainly slowing it down. I
Gotcha.
mean, and not even by choice. I mean, creativity is a very strange thing, and I've been doing it my whole life, and I still can't really explain it. The obsession, a song gets in your head, and you've got to get it out, So there's that thing, and then add some work ethic to that, and a project and a deadline, and you just go go go, So that whatever that obsession is, the switch is kind of half turned off now, and I don't know how to turn it on again. So it's almost like uh, you know, uh, it's almost like you don't write songs, songs write you, and
Hmm.
and that obsession has somewhat diminished in recent years. So that's the best I can explain it.
Well, a brighter note, the opposite end of that whole thing. I love your website because a lot of songwriters who have hits would just go, "Yep, that was a hit. That's it." And in your case, you actually post demos, you actually put credits up there, who else recorded it,
Yeah.
etc. In other words, it's a lot of work to do what you do about your art. When did that whole journey start?
With the website, you mean, or
With the website? Because, for example,
oh,
I loved the Brett Michaels section of that whole thing. That was so
okay, yeah,
intriguing. And I think people would have to dig around to get that. But even if they like the more obvious stuff like Aerosmith, that stuff is there too.
yeah. Well, I mean, I just poked away at the website slowly over probably 30 years, just add a little bit every day, and then, well, listen, I'd like to interview you about your website. It's remarkable,
No.
very eclectic, But you would know, you just a little bit every day, and I love the stories. I don't mean my stories. I mean, I live for the stories, like the songs and stories behind the Beatles and the Stones. So I read voraciously. So I guess I'm just kind of contributing my stories in my way.
Well, I want to come back to the website in a second, but somebody asked this week, "Do you want to interview Bernard Purdy?" And I went, "Oh, I have to just to put the Jim website stuff in there." And we're still waiting to hear if that's even going to happen. Just wanted to
Yeah,
tell you that thing. But with the website, the fact that you have the demos and all that, I encounter a lot of people who don't have much from their career. You seem to have everything. Were you always a pack rat? And I mean that in a good way.
Well, yeah, I think when I say obsessive about the songwriting thing, I think I'm obsessive and compulsive in a number of ways. So yeah, I'm a collector and an organizer. I keep track of things. I've kept just about everything, lyrics and demos and on and on and on. I mean, there was an interesting thing a few years ago, good story. So I wrote a bunch of songs with Steven Tyler and Joe Perry in the late 80s, early 90s. So with Aerosmith. So they recorded, I think, 12 things we wrote together, but there were other songs we wrote that typically, you write something and it doesn't make the record, and the next thing you know, it just goes on a shelf and you forget about it. So I think it was like 30 years after I'd worked with them, I got an email, just random email from a fan saying, "Well, congratulations. These fans know more about you and your music than you do." But this
Right.
fellow said, "Congratulations, Aerosmith are finally releasing the song Legendary Child," which is one of the outtakes from 30 years ago that I'd almost forgotten about. And I went, "Oh, great." It's always a treat. So I looked into it and I wasn't credited as a songwriter. So I got in touch with their management to straighten it out. And they said, "You didn't write that song." I said, "Well, yeah, I did." And Stephen and Joe had completely, in their defense, they had completely forgotten over 30 years that I
Yes.
had written it. But their manager got a little hard-ass and said, "Well, prove it." And I went, "Okay." So I, went down in my basement and went through some boxes, and I found not just the demo we had done in my basement studio 30 years ago, but I used to leave a cassette tape running all the time when I was writing, like 120-minute cassette. You just run. Because often when you're writing, what would happen? 2 or 3 guys in a room, and you're just kind of jamming, and you go, "Oh, that was cool. What was that you displayed? You mean this? No, 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 the other thing. You mean this? No, 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 the other thing." And then you can wind the cassette back, and go, "There, there it is." So I found the cassette that was running while we were writing that song. So I had like ample proof. You could hear us talking, me and Stephen and Joe, and working on the song. So I sent that to their manager and said, here's the proof. And bingo, sort of. But yeah, I do keep everything.
It's funny, part of my rude interruption right there, but how 30 years later, a cut on a major label album is not worth very much compared to what it might have been worth back then, but they'd fight you over that much, giving up credit, considering that just about every Aerosmith song for the last 30 years has had co-writers on it.
Yeah, I mean, it was no big deal. It was more the manager that I had to deal with, and Stephen and Joe, and Stephen called later and apologized. He's a sweet guy, but they just forgotten. And then it was their manager who kind of went all manager on me.
Yeah, managers are going to manage. And I've had to be in that position where you just deliver the bad news. The artist has to be the public nice person, and then they go, "Yeah, but tell them this." And then
Yeah.
you do that kind of crap. So one thing I'm curious about in working with songwriters is sometimes the cuts came from the publisher being very persistent and negotiating, and other times the cuts only happen when the artist gets in the room with the other artist, or the writer gets in the room with the other
Yeah.
artist. For you, was it mostly just getting in the room and you yourself, or is there a lot of publishing people sending around songs to get them placed?
Well, early on, when I was just getting started and didn't have much of a track record as a writer, my publisher was involved getting songs to people, and it was like really tough. Writing a song and trying to get it to an artist is about a 1% chance of it happening.
Sure.
But if you sit in a room and write a song with the artist, with the person who's going to sing it, there's about a 99% chance it's going to get on the album. So over time, as I got a few credits that I could sort of use as a calling card, then artists started asking for me, or labels, or not publishers, but managers and producers a lot. So with Aerosmith, it was John Kolodner, the A&R guy that signed them to Geffen Records, who got in touch with me to write with them. And so, I mean, again, back to Aerosmith, that was interesting because they were a little reluctant, I think. It was the first time they'd written with writers outside the band. And it was me and Desmond Child, and I forget who else, just me and Desmond.
Holly Knight. Yeah, that's way before Marty Fredrickson. I'm going through my mental Rolodex right there.
Yeah, this was Permanent Vacation, sort of their comeback album. They'd had a decade of ups and downs and rehab and so on. And in fact, they were just out of rehab when I met them for the first time, when
Right.
Steve and Joe came to my house. And again, just the sweetest guys, super talented. But you know, I'm a Aerosmith fan, and suddenly Steven Tyler and Joe Perry are walking into my house. You know, so you're kind of freaking out a little bit. You have to find a place to park that. But we got to work right away and wrote a song the first day. And then, you know, a year later, the next album, well, on that album, they were a little reluctant at first to work with outside writers. On the next album, a year later, they actually asked for me. So I did 3 albums in a row with them, which was great. So to answer your question, yeah, once the ball gets rolling and you have a few credits and people start asking for you, then you're always with the artist. You know, so after that, it was, you know, Alice Cooper and Ozzy and Bret Michaels on and on, you know, for decades.
And Europe, I do like the music that you did with Europe, and I don't think that gets talked about a lot. Was that the typical case of get the artist in the room, or were those leftovers?
No, that was Joey. It was, you know, sent over to Canada, and we spent a week writing. Yeah, so yeah, in every case, it was sitting with the artist. After that, I hardly wrote a song on Spec ever again, because the phone was always ringing, and I was lucky enough to, you know, always have someone coming around to write with.
Were most of the songs written in Vancouver?
Yeah, I did a little bit of travel, but by this time I had a new baby at home, and you know, I didn't really want to leave home a lot, and I was never a band member really, so you know, touring and being away a lot wasn't.
Prism.
Yeah, but way early on, you know, in my
Right.
early 20s, I was in one band, and you know, discovered quickly that, especially early days of a band's career when you're just getting started, is, you know, touring is the 5 guys in a rental car eating microwave tacos at gas stations, you know.
Sure.
And I did
Yeah.
that for a while and just realized I don't want to do this. I want to sleep in my own bed and write songs, you know. So that
So
after
when
that, yeah.
I mentioned
Like,
Vancouver, oh, sorry about that, Jim. Bad timing on my
yeah,
end. The Vancouver curiosity from my end comes with the fact that obviously what you and Brian did is a large part of that. Loverboy and Bob Rock and the ascent of that kind of happened as well. And I think some of that in the warehouse that Brian
yeah.
owned or co-owned, etc. So because of that, Motley Crue, Aerosmith, David Lee Roth, all these people made landmark albums in Vancouver. So what would have happened had you not been from Vancouver?
Well, it's Bruce Fairbairn that's really to be credited. So Bruce was the producer, and he and I were in prison together. I've known Bruce. He's passed away now, but you know,
Yeah.
we've known each other since we were teenagers. So we were in bands way back. And then when he started to get a career as a producer, you know, Bon Jovi and then Aerosmith and, you know, on and on and on. I mean, Kiss, Motley Crue, yes. Bruce is the one who brought all these bands to Vancouver. And Little Mountain Sound was the studio of his choice.
Hmm.
And even Bob Clearmountain, when he came from New York to work with Brian, Bob Clearmountain was, said, "This is the best maintained studio I've ever been in." There were 2 guys there, John Vertasek and Ron Obvious, the engineer and the technician. They kept that studio like nothing ever went down. Tape machines did not break, console did not have any buzz or noise, like, and everything worked. So bands were happy to come there, work with Bruce. Vancouver is a nice city, you know, the ocean, the mountains. So it just became this creative center, you know. So I was very lucky to just be there for that. I think had I not been there, had it not happened in Vancouver, a lot of my, you know, career opportunities wouldn't have happened. So I really credit Bruce Fairbairn with all of that.
And I mentioned the David Lee Roth album in that era, which was done at Little Mountain. And that
Yeah.
was in the era when you and Brian weren't writing together. But that particular album from Dave, he used every outside songwriter possible. He had Mark LaFrance singing backup, all the usual cats for all that kind of stuff. Did you write anything or try to write anything for the Little Ain't Enough album?
No, that wasn't on my radar at all. So in fact, this is the first I've heard about it. I didn't even know he had done it at Little Mountain. So yeah, I was out of the loop around that time, I guess, for working with somebody else.
Gotcha. So that whole hiatus from Brian, obviously you eventually reunited, which is fantastic, but you didn't slow down at any period of your career. That's how it looks to me from going over your website, looking at Wikipedia and All Music Guide and all that, but do you see a period where you slowed down?
Not really. I mean, Bryan and I had, 10 really good years in the beginning. So I met him in January 1978. We wrote a song the very first day we got together and never stopped for
Hmm.
more than 10 years. And then, I guess you put two guys in a room with no windows for 12 hours a day for 10 years. We started getting on each other's nerves, and the time came to just, move on. So Bryan moved on to Mutt, and then I moved on to Aerosmith and Ozzy and others, and we both just kept going. And then I've lost track of time. I mean, another 5 or so years went by, and then Bryan kind of circled back and said, let's start writing again. So we just picked up where we left off, and we've been doing it ever since.
So to kind of repeat myself, it's not like you said, I'm going to take 2 years and go to India and travel around the world to do nothing. You kind of went from that busy manic pace with Bryan to a busy manic pace with everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I just kept going, and as long as the phone kept ringing, I mean, talking about taking time off, I would even, because I had a family, I would even sort of in my calendar, I'd go, okay, I'm going to take that week off, and I'd black it out, and then the phone would ring. Can you squeeze this in? And then that week would end up being a work week. But what I learned from Bruce Fairbairn also, he was very family oriented. So as
Hmm.
busy as he was, he always made time for his family. And so I learned from Bruce how to do that. So I can say to my credit as a parent, I spent a lot of time with my son when he was growing up, but I also, got a lot of work done. In fact, my studio for the longest time was in my house. So
Hmm.
I had a, 2-year-old toddler who would come down to the studio, and there was a glass, he'd look through the glass, and then of course, it'd be Joan Jett or someone would go,
Yeah.
oh, who's that? And he would come in and go, hi, Joan Jett, and everybody loved, having him around. And of course, he kind of just soaked it up. And then the next thing I know, he's like 13, 14, and I'm hearing, he's playing the drums. He's down in the studio, playing the drums. And then he became a musician himself, no surprise. So my point being, family was also a very, very big part of my life, in addition to my career.
In the small world nature of it all, Joan Jett lives in my town. I think I saw her at the pharmacy a month and a half ago, that kind of thing. People have
Great.
their Joan Jett sightings rather. And have you ever been to this town, Long Beach, New York, where she went, hey, you got to write here?
I have not, no. Joan came to Vancouver. We wrote there.
There, that checks out. They come to Jim. So with
Yeah.
with all that kind of stuff, with the consistency, the writing, etc., and this is intended to be a compliment. When we talk about other people who've had a lot of cuts and a lot of success as songwriters, we hear about, oh, they had a bad publishing deal. Oh, they didn't get along with these people. For Jim Vallance, we hear none of those stories about complaining or being difficult.
Oh, good.
So, so is that by design, or are you just always a positive person and have always been positive for a creative person?
I guess. I mean, it's not something I worked on or thought about or planned, I just really love what I do. And I feel by luck or however, so fortunate to have worked with some really talented, lovely people. I can't point to anyone who was unpleasant or I left the session and went, I'll never work with them again. Everyone brought positivity and energy to the writing session. And I'm so grateful for all of that.
Well, I was going more on the angle of you that a lot of your fellow Aerosmith co-writing peers, any chance they get in an interview, they'll talk about, oh, that was a bad publishing deal. I was ripped off. I don't know what I was doing. And then
Ah,
when we talk about Jim Vallance, it's always, yeah, nice guy. We wrote some great songs together, and that's all you really hear.
well, that's great. And, and the publishing side, I mean, that's a whole other world too. Um, I mean, my dad was a small town bank manager. So I think if anything, I may have got a little bit of money sense from him. I mean, some people in my business have no clue how to take care of that side of things. I mean, there's a reason they call it the music business.
Yeah.
They really coexist. And yeah, I know horror stories about, publishing deals gone wrong and royalties not being paid, and just for lack of taking care of business, and Randy Bachman. But no, I've
Yeah.
been very fortunate on both sides, you know, the music and the business. I've had good advice, good people taking care of me. And as I say, just blessed to have worked with such wonderful creative people over the years.
So two quick questions and then I'll let you go. And the first one is, a lot of the artists that you co-wrote with have been doing their big estate sales and catalog sales in recent years. Is that something that you've even been thinking of?
I thought about it a lot and was approached a lot from different companies who were buying catalogs. And speaking of good advice, I spent probably a year looking into it,
Hmm.
and the sort of generic thoughts that went through my mind, should I or shouldn't I, is when we go back to say the 70s and 80s and 90s, the business model was pretty clear and understandable. You made a record, it got pressed vinyl, it went to the record store, someone went in, bought the vinyl, paid for it, took it home, and if people bought one album, you got paid once, and if people bought 1,000,000 albums, you got paid 1,000,000 times, and it was a pretty understandable business model. Then 1999, if I'm right, along comes Napster, and suddenly music is free. You don't even have to go to the record store. You can just grab an MP3 off the internet. And then record stores started to close and sales diminished. And then it was not quite the disaster that it could have been. Somehow the record companies picked up the slack, and then CDs were helpful. That was a whole other thing. And then the online thing, I think Napster, there were viruses and so on. And so, you know, people went more to legitimate outlets for digital music, and then royalties kicked in again. And that sailed along for a while. But then I still started to think, okay, can this go forever? You know, my royalties were still really good all through the 2000s. But there's three things that could have happened. One, as you project towards the future, the royalties will continue forever. You know, summer '69 will keep paying my rent, you know, for the rest of my life and never change. That's choice number one. Choice number two, at some point, it's all going to fall off a cliff, which I thought was happening with Napster, and I thought was happening, you know, a couple of times with streaming, you know, but the royalties still kept pretty darn good. And the third choice was, there are people way smarter than me. If I sell my catalog, suddenly things are going to just take off, and I'll go, I shouldn't have done that. So anyway, lots of good advice. Forensic royalty accountant in the UK was very helpful. Peter Paterno.
Oh, Peter Paterno. Yeah.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
And I just, and then Bob Dylan sold his catalog, and Bruce Springsteen sold his catalog. You know, I decided to pull the trigger, and I did a number of years ago. Sold my catalog to a company called Brownhill. Really happy with their offer, and ever since, not for a minute have I regretted it, because, you know, the money's in the bank, earning interest that is pretty much equivalent to what my royalties were anyway. So if things go off the cliff, that's Brownhill's problem. If things stay the same, good for them. And if they know something I don't know and royalties take off, well, again, good for them, you know?
Yeah. Worst case scenario is you get the key to the city and your music is celebrated for decades to come, and that's not so bad, while the money earns interest.
And who knows where it's going? I mean, the music business, like I said, there was a time when the business model was very transparent and understandable. And honestly, right now, I know nothing about streaming. Like Summer '69 has had more than 1 billion streams.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean $1 billion. You know, it's like, I don't know where it goes. So if I don't understand the business model, I'm much happier. I understand how banks pay interest. That I understand. That's, you know, a business model that everyone understands. So that's the one I went for.
Okay, and the last question for you, because you're very mysterious, but we know you're a family man. We know that every now and then you come out of hiding to do some writing for a project we do here. But what's the main hobby or way that you decompress outside of creative endeavors?
I mean, hobbies. I have silly hobbies. Well, one is actually my website, and you pointed to the Bernard Purdy
Yes.
section. You know, and it took a lot of research and time to put that page together, because I started off. I was angry. If people who are watching this don't know the whole story, Bernard Purdy is probably the most recorded session drummer in history. He's played for everybody, Aretha Franklin, Rolling Stones, Hall & Oates, on and on and on. Among his credits, he claims that he played on the first 3 Beatle albums. He variously claims that he either fixed the drums or did the drums completely. And then further goes on to say, Ringo, quote unquote, Ringo played on nothing. Now, Ringo is my hero. When I was 11 years old, I was watching TV one night, and suddenly there was this band called the Beatles, and it was like, whoever those guys are, whatever they're doing, I want to do that. And right. From that moment on, I have not varied. Music has been my life, but those guys changed my life. And Ringo is a great drummer. He's not just a hero of mine. He is an inspiration. And anybody who knows drums knows that Ringo almost invented, the drum fill and the modern style of drumming. So for someone like Bernard Purdie to say Ringo played on nothing, it just made me angry. So you can go to my website, read the Bernard Purdie section, and I think I present a pretty good argument, with lots of credible evidence to prove that no way. The only thing Purdie may have played on is
the Tony Sheridan stuff.
Way early, before Ringo even joined the band, there was some pretty rough, sort of demos and recordings with Pete Best on drums. And I think maybe the record company brought Purdie into. He couldn't have replaced the drums the way things were recorded back then. Everything was on one track, mono, so you couldn't remove the drums. You could today with AI, but not back then. So
yeah,
Purdie may have added a hi-hat or a cymbal crash here or there to Pete Best's drumming a year before Ringo even joined the band. So basically, Bernard Purdie, for reasons that I don't understand, is lying. So I've taken upon myself to prove him wrong. So that's with that part of the website. There's another part of my website that's even more quirky. I see faces everywhere. Like I'll see a stain on the sidewalk and it looks like a human face. So I'll take a picture of it. Or I'll see a fire hydrant with 2 spouts and I'll take a picture of that. So if you go to my website, there's a whole section. I've got about 300 pictures. Some are better than others, but 300 pictures of just silly things that look like human faces. So I don't spend a lot of time on that. It's not like a full-time hobby. And then the other thing is family research. I've traced various branches of my family back to the 1400s and earlier.
Wow.
Combed through libraries in England and spent years and decades doing that. So that's also a hobby. So yeah, I have other interests other than music that keep me busy and diversions.
Well, thank you for the decades of great art. Looking forward to what's to come. Not just the face photos, not just the Purdie research, but the forthcoming Bryan record, etc. So thank you for being you, Jim.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Paltrow.